Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be exploring the book of Ecclesiastes.
Specifically, chapters 1 through 3.
Yeah, chapters 1 through 3 of Ecclesiastes.
That's right.
And this is a book that I think a lot of people maybe haven't read.
Yeah.
Or maybe they've heard like the really famous parts.
Yeah, the sound bites.
But they haven't really dug deep.
That's right.
And so that's what we're going to do today. And I think
We're going to dive deep.
you might be surprised to find wisdom in what's often considered a kind of gloomy part of the Bible.
Yeah, it can definitely come off as a little bit pessimistic
Yeah.
on the first read.
But I think that there's some really thought-provoking insights in here.
Oh, yeah.
And so we meet this character we call the preacher.
The preacher.
And he's traditionally believed to be King Solomon.
That's right.
Right? And we're talking about a guy who had it all.
Had it all.
Wealth, power, wisdom.
Everything.
You name it.
Yeah, he had it.
But still felt like something was missing.
And yet he still felt like something was missing. That's right.
So it really makes you think, right? If Solomon, with all his advantages, couldn't find lasting satisfaction, what hope is there for us?
That's the question that's driving this whole book.
Yeah.
And it really starts out with those super famous opening lines. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity.
Okay, so let's break this down. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does that even mean?
So it doesn't mean just being obsessed with your appearance.
Okay, good.
In this context, vanity refers to the fleeting nature of everything in this world. This idea that everything we're striving for, all of our accomplishments, ultimately amount to nothing.
Whoa. Okay, so that sounds pretty bleak.
It can be, yeah.
I mean, have you ever felt that way? Like no matter how much you achieve or how much you acquire, it's still not enough.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we've all been there at
Yeah.
different points in our lives.
Yeah.
And Solomon, even with all his wisdom and wealth, he couldn't escape this feeling of emptiness.
Yeah, and it's so easy to see how this applies to us today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we are constantly bombarded with messages telling us we need to buy this, we need to achieve, that we need to look this certain way, and it's exhausting.
Yeah, that desire for more, this constant striving for the next big thing, it's a trap.
Yeah.
Solomon is warning us about it.
So are we just saying that everything is meaningless then?
Well, no, not at all.
Okay.
Ecclesiastes isn't about nihilism.
Right. Yeah.
It's not just saying give up, nothing matters.
Right.
It's about finding meaning in the right place.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that the things of this world, while we can enjoy them, shouldn't be our ultimate source of happiness or security.
So where do we find that deeper meaning then?
Well, for Solomon, that foundation was his relationship with God.
Okay, so is he talking about religion?
Yes, but it's more nuanced than just blind faith or following a set of rules.
Yeah.
It's about aligning our lives with something bigger than ourselves, something that gives us a sense of purpose and direction.
I see what you're saying. It's about finding something that isn't shaken by the ups and downs of life.
Yeah.
Something that gives us a sense of hope and resilience.
Exactly. And for Solomon, that was God.
Okay, so that makes sense, but how do we actually do that? How do we know what God's will is for our lives? And how do we stay connected to God when life gets crazy and we get tempted by all those shiny things?
No, those are great questions. And to be honest, those are the same questions that Solomon wrestles with throughout the book. It's not about having all the answers right away. It's about wrestling with those big questions and seeking God's wisdom.
So it's not about being perfect, but about being on this journey
That's a great way to put it.
of learning and growing closer to God.
Yes, and I think that's one of the most powerful messages of Ecclesiastes. It's about the journey.
So we've talked about this feeling of emptiness, this vanity of vanities, and how we need something deeper. But Solomon doesn't just leave us hanging with this feeling of emptiness, does he?
No, not at all. In fact, he gives us some practical advice on how to navigate life's complexities and find genuine joy. And one of the best-known passages that illustrates this is chapter 3, A Time for Everything.
I love this chapter. It's so beautifully written. With this really poetic structure, you have all these contrasting pairs, birth and death, planting and harvesting, weeping and laughing.
It's such a brilliant literary device. It highlights the natural rhythms of life, the ups and downs that we all experience.
But it's more than just pretty poetry, right?
Yeah.
What's the deeper message here? What's he trying to tell us with these contrasting pairs?
I think he's reminding us that life is not meant to be a constant upward trajectory. We're going to go through tough times, times of sorrow, but there will also be times of joy, celebration, and reaping what we've sown. It's all part of the natural order of things.
So it's about accepting the reality of change and not fighting against those natural rhythms.
Exactly. And I think there's a sense of freedom in that acceptance. It frees us from the pressure to be happy all the time, to be constantly achieving. It allows us to just embrace the full spectrum of human experience.
And that leads us to my favorite verse in this whole chapter. He has made everything beautiful in its time.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Huh.
It's a powerful reminder that God's timing is perfect even when we don't get it.
Yeah. It's not saying that everything is beautiful right now, but that there's a bigger picture, a divine timing that we can't always grasp. It's about trusting that God is at work, even in the messy and painful times. He's weaving together something beautiful.
And that requires trust, doesn't it?
It does. And it's something I think we could all use a little more of, that deep, unwavering trust in God's goodness
Absolutely.
and his plan for our lives.
So Ecclesiastes isn't just about accepting life's ups and downs passively.
But
It's about actively seeking wisdom, purpose, and connection with God in every season.
I love how we're going deeper than just the everything is meaningless idea, and we're getting into this message of hope and resilience.
Exactly. And that's what makes Ecclesiastes so relevant for us today. We live in a culture obsessed with achievements, possessions, and instant gratification. But Solomon's wisdom reminds us that there's a better way, a path to true joy and lasting satisfaction.
I'm excited to explore that path even further in the next part of our deep dive.
Me too. There's so much more to uncover. So before the break, we were talking about how Solomon found true meaning by aligning his life with God's will.
Right, you were saying that's where we find true joy and fulfillment.
That's what it seems like. It can sound a little overwhelming, though, this whole aligning our lives with God's will thing.
It does. Like,
Yeah.
how are we even supposed to know what God's will is for us? It's not like we get step-by-step instructions.
You're right. It's not always a perfectly clear path. But I think Ecclesiastes offers us some good guidance.
Okay, I'm listening.
Well, if you think back to chapter 2, verse 26, it says, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that verse. It's like it's saying that pleasing God is the key to unlocking that true joy and fulfillment.
That's it. So maybe instead of asking, what's God's will for my life, we should be asking, how can I live in a way that pleases God?
I like that. It's less about trying to figure out some big master plan and more about making choices every day that show we want to honor God.
Yes, exactly. But then, of course, the question becomes, how do we actually do that? How do we know what pleases God?
Right. It can't just be about following rules. There's got to be more to it than that.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about outward actions. It's about what's going on in our hearts. And one of the most important things is to build a genuine relationship with God.
Okay, so it's more about connecting with God on a personal level rather than just going through the motions of religion.
Exactly. And we build that relationship through things like studying the Bible, praying, and being part of a community of faith.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. You mentioned studying the Bible. How does that help us figure out how to please God?
Well, the Bible's like a window into God's heart. It
Yeah.
shows us who he is, what he values, and what he wants for us.
So by reading those stories and teachings and soaking in that wisdom, we can start to get a grasp of what it means to live a life that lines up with God's will.
Exactly. It's not about just memorizing verses. It's about letting those words shape our understanding of God and our relationship with him.
What about prayer? Where does that fit into all this?
Prayer is how we talk to God. It's that two-way conversation where we can share everything with him, our joys, our struggles, and ask for his guidance.
So it's not just about asking God for things. It's also about listening for his voice and being open to what he might be saying.
That's right. And sometimes he speaks to us in ways we might not expect. It might be a quiet thought, a verse that stands out to us, or maybe even through a conversation with a friend.
It's about paying attention to how God might be working in our everyday lives.
Yes. And the more we practice listening, the easier it becomes to recognize his voice.
You also mentioned community earlier. Why is that so important for living a life that pleases God?
Well, because we weren't meant to do this whole faith thing on our own. We need other people to support us, encourage us, and keep us accountable.
Yeah, it's so much easier to stay focused on what's important when you've got people around you who share your values.
I agree. And being part of a community also gives us chances to serve others, which is a big part of what it means to please God.
It's not just about us and God. It's about extending his love to the people around us.
Exactly. So finding God's purpose for your life, it's not about having a sudden epiphany or dramatic calling.
It's about cultivating a relationship with God through these things we've been talking about and really paying attention to how he's leading us.
And trusting that he has a plan for you, even if you can't see the whole picture right now.
That takes some of the pressure off, knowing we don't have to have it all figured out. We just need to trust that he'll guide us.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important theme in Ecclesiastes, this idea of living with an eternity mindset.
Eternity mindset. It sounds kind of intense. What does that even mean?
Well, think about it. Solomon was constantly bumping up against this reality that everything in this world is temporary. He had all the riches and power and pleasure anyone could imagine, but it all felt fleeting and kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of
It's like
things.
vanity of vanities all over again.
Right. But instead of that making him despair, it pointed him toward a deeper truth.
What was that?
That real fulfillment can only be found in something that lasts forever. And for Solomon, that was God.
So having an eternity mindset means remembering that this life isn't all there is, that the choices we make now have consequences that go way beyond our time on Earth.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our souls are eternal and what we do here matters for eternity.
Okay, but does that mean we should just ignore everything in this world and only focus on the afterlife? Like, should we all go live in caves?
No, not at all. It's not about rejecting the world or pretending our lives here don't matter. It's about finding the right balance.
Okay, so how do we find that balance? How do we live in the world without getting totally caught up in stuff that doesn't last?
I think it's about recognizing that the things of this world are gifts from God.
Yeah.
They're meant to be enjoyed and used wisely, but not to be the things that make us truly happy or secure.
So we can enjoy good food and beautiful things and meaningful relationships, but we don't put all our hope in those things.
Right, because if we do, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. Those things will fade or change or be taken away from us eventually.
But our relationship with God, our eternal life with Him, that's something that can never be taken away.
And that's where we find true security and lasting joy.
So it's all about keeping our priorities straight, not letting the things of this world become more important than the things that truly matter.
And this goes back to what we were saying earlier about finding our purpose in God.
Oh yeah, because if our purpose is rooted in something eternal, it gives our lives meaning no matter what's going on around us.
Exactly. And that gives us hope and resilience, even when things are hard, knowing that our ultimate destiny is in God's hands.
It's like having an anchor to hold on to when the storms of life are raging.
I love that image. And that's what Solomon held on to as he went through all the ups and downs of life.
So living with an eternity mindset doesn't mean escaping from the world. It means engaging with it differently.
With perspective, purpose, and most importantly, hope.
I'm starting to get it, but it can still feel a little overwhelming. Trying to balance living in the now with keeping eternity in mind.
I get it. It's a constant tension we're all dealing with. But that's where I think the wisdom of Ecclesiastes comes in. It's not about finding some perfect formula. It's about embracing the journey, learning and growing along the way.
So it's okay to not have it all figured out, to struggle and question and even make mistakes sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. We're all in this together, and God is so patient with us.
That's good to hear. Knowing that God isn't expecting us to be perfect. He just wants us to keep seeking Him, keep growing, and keep trusting Him.
Exactly. And that's one of the most beautiful things about Ecclesiastes. It acknowledges the messiness of life, the ups and downs, and then offers us this path to true meaning and fulfillment, a path that's grounded in a relationship with God.
I feel like you've really helped me see this book in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a book that I keep coming back to, always finding new layers of meaning in it.
Hold on. I feel like we're just getting started here. There's still more to uncover.
You're right. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still some gems of wisdom we haven't even touched yet.
I'm ready to keep digging. What else can we discover in this book? So we've been on quite the journey through Ecclesiastes, haven't we?
We have. It's a book that really makes you think.
It does. It's like these ancient words were written just for us, even though they're thousands of years old. We've talked about how chasing after fleeting pleasures doesn't really satisfy us, how important it is to find our purpose in something bigger than ourselves, and how comforting it is to remember that God is in control, even when our lives feel totally chaotic.
And that whole idea of living with an eternity mindset, making choices today with the understanding that this life is just a small part of a much bigger story.
Yeah, so much to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive into Ecclesiastes, what are some of the key takeaways we can carry with us into our everyday lives?
Well, one of the most powerful lessons for me is that true fulfillment, it doesn't come from collecting things or achievements. It comes from our relationship with God.
It's not about what we have, but who we are.
Right. It's about aligning our lives with His purpose, seeking His wisdom, and finding our deepest joy in Him. And that takes a shift in perspective, a willingness to look at the world through the lens of eternity.
So instead of being consumed by the here and now, we're always aware of the bigger picture, the things that really matter.
And that changes everything. It affects how we use our time, how we treat other people, how we react to challenges. It frees us from the pressure to always be doing something and gives us the space to focus on what will last.
It's like we're finally able to live the lives we were made for, But there's still that tension, isn't there? We're called to live in the world, to enjoy the good things it offers, but without getting caught up in its fleeting pleasures. How do we do that?
That's the big question. And I think Ecclesiastes offers some clues. Remember that passage about there being a time for everything, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to embrace and a time to let go.
Yeah, it reminds us that life has different seasons, each with its own beauty and purpose.
Right. Instead of always trying to make things happen on our own schedule, we can learn to trust God's timing, to embrace the natural rhythms of life.
And that's surrender. Letting go of our need to control everything that can bring so much peace, especially in our fast-paced world.
It's definitely a different way of living, but it's a way that leads to contentment and lasting joy. And it all starts with gratitude.
Gratitude. How does that fit in?
When we remember that everything we have, our talents, our relationships, even our breath, are gifts from God, it changes our perspective. We start focusing on what we've been given instead of what we're missing.
It's like looking at the world through a different lens.
Exactly. We start noticing those little blessings, the everyday miracles, the simple things that bring us joy. And that kind of gratitude is powerful. It can really push back against the negativity that tries to creep into our hearts.
It's a choice we make, isn't it? To focus on the good, to see the beauty, to be thankful in all circumstances. And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take from Ecclesiastes.
I think so too. It's a lesson that can change our lives from the inside out.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Ecclesiastes, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. If you knew for sure that everything in this life is temporary, how would that change your priorities today?
That's a good question. It really makes you think about what's truly important.
Because when we live with that eternity mindset, it can help us find true joy and meaning no matter what's happening in our lives. It's about aligning ourselves with what will last, investing in relationships that matter, and chasing after a purpose that goes beyond the limits of this world.
And that's a journey we're taking. Thanks for joining us on